Thanks everyone for joining today's session on considering governance, risk and compliance when using data. We're going to look at that from the perspective of the sorts of enterprise companies that we at Thorogood work with. So I'll start by introducing the company and introduce myself, and then we'll dive into today's topic. So to start with, Thorogood is a company that specializes in data and data analytics. So we look at the data itself, we look at how we can apply analytics to it. We look at understanding the technology that goes around it, and we look mainly at how we use all of those things to approach business challenges, business problems and opportunities with our customers, and helping them to understand how they can use the technology and the analytics to deliver value. A key part of that is what we're going to talk about today, and understanding how we can do that in a secure, reliable fashion. Just to give you a bit of a sample of the sorts of companies we work with companies that are typically large global companies in a particular set of sectors, so consumer goods, pharmaceutical and life sciences, retail banking and capital markets, and insurance companies, as well as a range of others that, again, are large and have data that is spread across the world, typically bringing that together. But as you can imagine, all of these companies have great levels of complexity in some of the privacy requirements of the data and thinking about how they govern their data and manage it appropriately. Brief introduction to myself. I'm Andrew Kennedy. I've been working for Thorogood for almost 10 years now, and I'm a cloud solution architect certified on Azure and AWS. I also work on machine learning, and I'm certified in that on those two platforms as well as on Google Cloud. So I've got a range of knowledge across the topics that Thorogood works on, but I've helped a number of customers look particularly at how they set up their data platform and thinking as part of that about some of the questions that we're looking at today. So as we go through it, we've titled it Governance, Risk and Compliance, because that's kind of the wider name for the topic. We'll look at those three things to begin with, though in the opposite order. So we'll start with compliance and then on to risk and governance. And then because we're talking about data, I want to get deeper into two particular topics that apply specifically to data side of things and talk about privacy and security a little bit. So I'm not going to get really deep into any of the topics. We'll just take a kind of overview of each of them. If anyone wants more detail, feel free to get in touch and we can talk in more detail about the specific topics that are of interest to you within that. But hopefully today you're here to get an overview of the full range and think about, where in this do you need to focus in your organization. To give a bit of context of where I brought some of the thinking from for this webinar, I'll start by introducing the DAMA Data Management Book of Knowledge. It is a common approach taken by a number of organizations to data management, introduced in a 600-page book, so I'm not going to get into the full depth of it by any means, but it's an approach widely used by enterprise organizations, particularly relevant for the data governance topic today, but we'll introduce a little bit of the thinking from that as we go through. I'm also approaching the topics in a way that we in Thorogood like to look at things, and that is to look at people, data, tools and process. So anytime we're doing kind of strategy projects or looking at how we put together a strategy, we'll think about things in those four areas and the different aspects that you can bring from each of those, and bringing into that a view of the business goals and a view of the technical possibilities that build towards it. Now, because we're looking at governance, risk and compliance today, we're going to go slightly wider than just the business goals and the technical possibilities and bring in a few other internal and external factors in alongside that. So as we look at that, some of the internal things might be company policies, the culture that you're trying to bring in, and how that plays into your ultimate business goals, as well as external things around the regulatory and compliance requirements. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And then also planning, control, development, and operational. Different types of actions, and these are ones introduced by that DAMA DM Data Management Book of Knowledge. So different types of actions you can take: planning, control, then more about the actual management of it and the implementation of those plans. Development, what hits at different points in the software development lifecycle as you're building up some of these solutions. And operational, managing these things on an ongoing basis and putting some of these things into practice. We'll talk through each of those topics a little bit, bringing some of those things in, but let's start with compliance. So 5 different areas we've got on the screen, different things you need to think about. It's not exhaustive, but hopefully this gives you some ideas of what to think about. Regulatory requirements cover things like what data you can store, how you can use it, and commonly now restrictions on things like even where you can store the data and some of what we refer to as data residency requirements. Then there's likely to be industry regulations, so things like HIPAA for health data or GLBA for financial services. Both of those are US focused, but depending on the industry and the data you're using, there might be requirements in other countries that you need to think about as well. Then a lot of companies will bring in voluntary standards, so standards that your organization voluntarily opts into, which have some form of compliance requirements. Often those are audited by external bodies. To give an example of that, Thorogood has ISO 27001 as an international standard for information security that we're certified on. We get audited on that regularly, and it's a certification that a lot of our clients hold to or are following as well. Then most companies will have internal policies about how you use and store data, again, thinking about how you meet your company goals, as well as how you match the regulations that you have to deal with as a company. And then another category is legal requirements and legal compliance. And that may be, if you're using third-party data, you might have legal agreements with some of the companies that you procure third-party data from. Or if you've got other parties handling some of your data, whether they're doing processing or analysis, there may be, legal agreements between the two parties there as to how you handle that data and things that you need to have in those legal agreements so that you meet your other compliance requirements. So just to dig in a little bit deeper into some of those and think about some of the figures as to why this is so important. Calling out some of the complexity, there are 71% of the countries in the world, if you go by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, they say 71% of countries have data protection and data privacy legislation. So that's the likes of, in the European Union, you have GDPR. For Singapore, where I'm based, we have the Personal Data Protection Act. Those bits and pieces of regulation all have a common purpose. But they'll have specific requirements and guidance, and that can give complications to global organizations in particular. And in terms of the impact of that on organizations, MicroStrategy did a survey where 49% of respondents said data privacy and security concerns are a barrier to more effective use of data and analytics. So it's important to help people in your organization think about and understand how they can use the data, having the right policies in place, making sure people are aware of how they can use the data appropriately so that you can realize the value from it and so that those things don't become a barrier. And then stating some of that opportunity from the data, Gartner recently said that they estimate that data and analytics leaders who share data externally, sharing data with third parties, deliver 3 times more measurable economic benefit than leaders who try and hold it close to their chest and don't share it with external groups. So whether you're thinking about sharing data externally or even just some of the other things you could do with data internally, there's great value in this data. And so while it's tempting to think, well, from a compliance perspective, the best way to reduce my risks is to use it less, that's missing out on a lot of the opportunity from the data that I'm sure a lot of us are thinking about delivering in our organizations. And so we need to be able to think about, from a compliance perspective, and understanding where our risks are from that. And that brings us neatly onto the second topic and thinking about those risks that we have. So just quickly calling out a few of the categories of risk that you might want to think about. Different organizations will look at different things, through their lens, and some of these things will be more important than others to each organization. But obviously there's compliance risks that we've talked a little bit about, but then things like reputation, and if people find out about the ways you're using data, how does that impact? Financial, if a system goes down even or the data is incorrect, what's the financial risk from that perspective? Operational, if you lose access to the data, what does that do to the way that you work? And ethical, actually thinking about your company culture, the way that you want to interact with the wider world. How do you make sure that the way you're using data aligns with your company culture and values? So a few of the different aspects of risk to think about there. I'll give you a set of questions that help to think about risk. So starting by looking at what is it that your organization wants to achieve, and then think about, a risk is anything that puts a danger to that. So what is it that might stop you achieving your goals? What is working against you in achieving your goals and your vision for the company? And then for each project, drill into that a little bit deeper. So what are the goals for the project? Similar questions. What might stop the project meeting its goals? What are the dependencies that there are on other projects? And as you're going through the project, then what ongoing dependencies are created? And that might be, your project is using data from an upstream project. Very often we do that when we're building systems. We're loading data from another system and we create a dependency there, and we need to be aware of that. Or if we're building in a nice new system that allows people to take better decisions in a particular area, and we're replacing an older system, we're creating a new dependency on the system that we have, and we need to think about where all those dependencies are from a risk perspective going forward as well. Also think about what unintended effects there could be when you set up a system. Maybe you're storing data or calculating data that suddenly becomes more of a risk from a PII perspective. Personally identifiable information is something that we think about a lot from a privacy angle. So think about what some of the unintended effects could be, even just from storing the data, making it more accessible if you've got new people using data sets. think about what some of the security and privacy implications of that are. And then when you have those risks, there are 4 different things that you can do with them. You could do something to avoid the risks. So if you're using customer names, for example, at the minute, or you're looking to use customer names, maybe you can replace that with a randomly generated identifier in some way that takes the name out of the data set and avoids the risk of storing that altogether. Then you might be able to transfer risks either by insuring in some way and making sure you've got the right kind of cyber insurance policies in place or whatever the relevant insurance is for what you're doing. Or you might be able to transfer some of the management of the risk. And that's something that companies are doing a lot today in terms of, the risk that the data platform becomes unavailable, outsourcing some of the management of that to the cloud vendors who have management in place to make sure that things like backup happens. There's a disaster recovery or an element of disaster recovery that they help with from their side. And so transferring some of the risk and some of the risk management. Then there's control. So what can you control within your organization? That might be things like thinking about how many people have access to the data. If you've got data that needs to be kept private or data that's really important, doesn't make it into the public space, having fewer people able to access that helps in some way to control the risk and keep your risk level lower. Again, you've got to balance all of these things against the potential business value. And at some point, you get to that level where you've got to accept the risk that there is. And it's really important to think about the balance of those things and not get yourself so hived off into that I must reduce the risk and avoid all the risks so that you don't use data at all, but thinking about what the appropriate way is to use the data while understanding how can I avoid transferring control as much of that risk as possible so that I'm managing the level of risk that the company is taking on in that. And to do that, for each of those risks, really, you want to go through, think, what are the risks? We've talked through some of the questions to that, but then understand what's the probability of that risk coming to pass and what's the impact and the severity if it happens. And understanding those things alongside, what's the impact of avoiding the risk? What's the impact of transferring or controlling it? And how much does that, if that reduces the value you're going to get from the project, understanding how much it reduces the value or how much extra effort you have to go to do those things helps to get that balance right in managing your level of risk and deciding, where are we going to avoid it and remove the risk altogether? Where can we transfer the risk? Where can we control it? And at the end of the day, what risks do we have to accept in this going forward and trying to manage those and understand them in whatever way we can. So that brings us on to governance. A major aspect in controlling and managing those risks, as well as tracking them going forward, is making sure that you have the right governance in place. And particularly from a data perspective, thinking about data governance and data platform governance. And this is where I'll refer to the data management body of knowledge, the DAMA DMBOK. Rather than trying to cover all of governance in this session, I'll just go to what some of the topics that they talk about as key areas of data governance to think about. And they talk about oversight, strategy, policy, standards and quality. So thinking about what quality do you need to maintain and how do you measure it? Stewardship, who owns the data, both from a technical perspective as well as from a business side. Who are the data stewards in your business who know what the data should be and how to get the best quality and usage out of it? Compliance, so understanding and documenting what all the requirements are and how you're going to meet those. Issue management, what do you do when something goes out of place in the data governance plans? Data management projects, increasing the data quality or increasing your visibility of the data quality, as well as data asset valuation, understanding the value of the data and understanding when it's worth spending more effort or more money on a data set, which of your data is the most important and delivering most value for the business, helps you to know where to prioritize in terms of the data governance. And when we think about data governance, I'm going to give you just 3 keywords and 3 key areas to think about for your data governance. Know that this topic's much wider, but these 3 I really think are key. First of all, your data governance needs to be sustainable. The policies and practices that you design will have to be implemented across the organization on an ongoing basis. So it's important to establish a strategy that aligns with and supports the overall business goals for your organization. And thinking about how multiple groups in the business implement these, think about how that wider group can use the approaches that you're defining centrally. Whatever governance strategy you have has to be embedded in the organization. Data governance practices need to become part of how data is collected, stored, and used. It needs to be an expected part of the life cycle, and that means getting buy-in from across the organization and from senior management. I know from some of the training sessions that I've been on, when you have someone from the top of the organization turning up to those sessions and introducing them, it highlights the importance of data governance to the organization and the way that you're using data. So that's a really valuable thing to think about there. And it has to be measured, measurement through defining the right KPIs, reporting and tracking those at an appropriate frequency. And that frequency is going to be different for different data sets and depending on the usage of it. But again, that helps ensure that the processes are followed, gives people visibility of what the data quality, the data management processes are like. And it also helps to show the value of the data governance in delivering for the organization, whether that's in terms of the quality or the compliance, being able to show that all of that is in place. Being able to present to management, look, these things are all in line, and the data governance efforts that we're putting in are delivering that is really important in being able to show the value of what you're doing. So now I'll get on to those two topics that we talked about adding on specifically from a data perspective, and I'll talk a little bit about privacy first. So thinking about some of the examples of more sensitive data that exists in the organization, and I'm sure everyone will think about specific examples that they've dealt with either recently or in the past or things they're about to look at. Personal data we've touched on already, personally identifiable information covered by a lot of regulatory requirements, typically. Then there's market sensitive data, particularly if a company's listed, there'll be requirements around that. But for every company, there's data that you want to hold as part of your company that controls how you manage the company that you want to keep within your organization. Then if organizations have intellectual property, whether that's just information that you hold about your customers that controls how you interact with them, through to actually design systems or trademarks or intellectual property from the perspective of designs of your systems, there's data that needs to be carefully controlled there. Then sometimes you have restricted third-party data. I worked with a client once whose data had to be held in a database in a particular city geographically just because of one of the agreements that they had. And it'll depend what your agreements are, and those third-party data typically is going to be restricted. You'll have some responsibility for keeping that data private, and there may be penalties or even just a relationship challenge if your end of the bargain isn't held up to, or you might struggle to get more data from them in the future. So there's data sets that you need to think about as well. And then something that is really important, just because it underpins so much of the rest of how we do privacy and security, the account and security data that there is for your organization needs to be kept really secure. And that's one particular area where I'd say make sure you're using technologies that are designed specifically for holding that kind of sensitive data when you're looking at account and security data. So a few different types of data that you need to think about there. And when you're looking at how you can ensure this confidential data is kept confidential, this is a great example of where we can apply that people, data, tools, and process thinking. I've put a number of things on the screen just as examples of some of the things that you can do, but really there are a range of things that you need to implement across your organization for keeping data secure in that way. So from a people perspective, think about who's got the ownership, and if you've got things like a data protection officer is required by some of the legislation that there is. Alongside that, making sure there's clear ownership and responsibility across the organization, who's holding ownership for particular data sets and who should have access to those, and making sure that everyone in your organization has the appropriate training in how to use the data sets, thinking about how you manage and control the access to those, and thinking who has access to them. Do they need particular training for particular data sets? From a data perspective, maybe that's thinking about what data you store. If there's data that you're not going to use, even data that from an ethical perspective you don't want to use in your organization, then maybe don't store that if that's the appropriate way to handle it. But for every other data set, understand the risk level in storing that data set and handle the data sets appropriately. From a tool perspective, how are you cataloging the data and making sure that you've got a record of how the data is cataloged? And increasingly companies are categorizing data, whether that data should be held just internally. Is it okay for anyone internally to access it? And we want to make data as widely available as possible. Or is that data going to be held to a really tight group of people? For example, working with a client looking at their internal audit data, where you've got people looking into potential risks in the way that their colleagues are behaving. That's something that you want a really, really small group of people to have access to that data. Even if they're building applications that might be more interesting for other people to look at, you still need to think about exactly who has access to that. And there are things from a tool perspective like encryption and masking. I mentioned earlier, covering a name up with a randomly generated unique ID. There are ways to do that with all sorts of data fields like credit card numbers that obviously most people in your organization don't need access to that credit card data. So just mask that, make sure they can't see it, various different ways of handling it. And then in terms of the processes in your organization, making sure you have a list of the data, why the data is being kept and what it's being used for. Quite often that's a requirement of the regulations, but even where data isn't covered by those regulations, maybe that's something that you want to implement for some of your important internal data. And then clear processes for requesting and approving access. to some of those data sets, so that when people should have access, you want to make that as easy as possible, but make sure that the right processes are followed as part of that. And then finally, a little bit on security. So there are kind of two key concepts that you'll come across in security: authentication and authorization. So that is, how do we know that this person is who they say they are? And then should they have access to the data sets that they're asking for access to, or the reports or the dashboards and so on? So those two key concepts in security, then backed up by a whole load of different aspects to security, and making sure that we've got a whole load of things in place. I've just got some examples on the screen, but these are all things that will be implemented in different places in your organization. So things like password and MFA policy likely is generally decided at the center of the organization. Similarly, for encryption, there's probably policies that your IT department will have in place, and for things like corporate network. And then for individual data sets, it may well be up to whether it's the data steward or owners of the different data sets to take a part in that audit and review process in making sure they understand who has access to the data set, and reviewing that regularly to make sure, maybe someone's changed role or changed department. They used to have access to some data sets. If they don't need that access anymore, then maybe it's time to remove that if it's a more sensitive data set. Similarly, things like monitoring can be implemented by some of the security tooling. And if there's risky behavior, particularly now that people are accessing a lot more from home, we might have things open to global networks. If there are, it used to be if someone was looking risky, they'd be walking into the office, and that's what we meant by risky behavior. Now maybe it's sign-ins from locations that your company doesn't have any offices, or even just an account logging in from an office that it shouldn't be. And some of the cloud tooling can do monitoring on that and set up alerting, or even things like automating and making sure that you do extra security checks in those cases and flagging some of the risks. So understand what some of the options are, the things that you need to think about as part of your project, and having a clear responsibility model is key in that. So what of that is owned by IT? What is owned by the data and analytics technical organization? What is owned by the data stewards in a particular data set? And who takes responsibility for which aspects of security? Especially that's important in the cloud world. And what I've got on screen at this point is the AWS shared responsibility model. And any of the cloud vendors will take responsibility for some of the security, and they'll pass other parts of security to the customer. So the AWS example, the security for their hardware and the first level of software that's on top of that all sits with AWS, and they take responsibility for the security, as they describe it, of the cloud. But then the customer is responsible for security in the cloud. And for us as an organization, when we're working with clients, then these are the things that we're looking at. It's that, how do we set the security in the customer data? Who has access to it? Setting up the logins and making sure those are implemented correctly. Things like firewall configuration and making sure that the right resources in the cloud have access to the correct other resources. So there's a whole set of thinking to be done on who owns what within that responsibility model. And then for the things in the customer end, who takes responsibility for which of those, who's doing the checking on it, and if there's any testing to be done of the security, have things been tested correctly. I'll finish by putting my contact details on the screen. Please add me on LinkedIn as we put more content out about this. We'll share it there, as well as letting you know about that through other means. Do get in touch. Thank you for joining the session, and I'm sure we'll hear from you again.